Hello and welcome to this second channel, the Reading Heart, um, as you have seen, where I share my inner thought process on stuff in the form of arts, poetry, etc. And to start this channel off, I wanted to bring you a short essay. So this will be a video essay on the topic of antinatalism. So the video in itself won't be that interesting visually because I will just talk, so you can listen to it in the background if you want. Anyways, it's a video essay, so let's start this off. So what is antinatalism actually? Antinatalism describes the philosophical position that procreation is immoral. So it is immoral to bring another child in the world. This immorality rests upon a number of arguments and general principles that I will try to cover in this essay to the best of my abilities. First argument or position is that no one asked to be born. The first and most important observation is the fact that with which this position of antinatalism takes issue is that no one asks or can ask to be born. A child isn't able to consent or decide whether it wants to be born or not. It is never the child's decision, but rather that of the parents to bring it into the world. Because of this, the child cannot be asked or cannot give consent to the most important thing that ever happens to them, coming into existence. Antinatalism then further argues that because consent is impossible and life is necessarily filled with at least some amount of suffering, which the child cannot be made aware of beforehand, because they are not the one making the decision to procreate and come into the world, it is therefore immoral for the parents to bring the child into the world. By doing so, they impose at least some amount of suffering upon them, suffering to which the child never had the ability to consent to. Second argument. The asymmetry of suffering and pleasure, after David Benatar, one of the modern core philosophers of antinatalism. When they first hear this line of reasoning, many people jump to an argument from a positive utilitarian standpoint. That is, that they argue that there is more pleasure than suffering in the world, and that if a child were not to be created, they would be deprived of said pleasure. Even though there's a serious point to be made that there's actually on average more suffering than pleasure, which would defeat the point altogether, the antinatalist has a much more logical tool on their hands. What is called pleasure is largely dependent on fulfilling the needs and or expectations of a human body and mind. We can take hunger as an example here. If a person feels hunger and then fulfills this hunger by eating a good meal, they feel pleasure during and after the process of eating. They fulfill their need for food and get rewarded for it by the brain with dopamine. The same is true for needs that do not arise directly, like exercise. Most people feel at least somewhat of a positive reaction to exercise because it has a positive effect on our body and is therefore evolutionarily relevant and worthy of being rewarded with pleasure. Of course, over the years, humans have found ways to hack the brain to release dopamine because they appeal to the same mechanisms of evolution without ever being beneficial, like doom scrolling. But that's besides the point. The antinatalist focuses on one aspect of that mechanism that is universal to the whole principle of pleasure. Pleasure is only needed once a person already exists, since it comes about through the satisfaction, or at least the illusion of satisfaction, of needs. If a person were to not exist in the first place, they would have no needs and therefore no desire to experience fulfillment of said needs, i.e. pleasure. Therefore, the Prevention of pleasure for a non-existent human being is morally neutral, since that non-existent human being has no desire to be born and experience said pleasure. As David Benatar himself put it, there is no row of ghost fetuses that want to be born, so there is no desire to be born for a non-born child in the first place. To address the asymmetry, in the contrary, the prevention of guaranteed harm and suffering to a human being is morally good, since the creation of that human being cannot be done for this human being, as they have no desire to come into existence in the first place. This is also why procreation is always and has always been selfish on the part of the parents. Cut. This is also why procreation is always and has to always be selfish on the part of the parents, since it cannot be argued that the creation of a child is done for the child because the child has no possibility to express any kind of desire prior to exist or to come into existence. There must always be some motive on the part of the parents to create a child for themselves. Interestingly, natalism is so normalized in today's culture and society that many parents outright admit this. Think of phrases like, "I want to have a child so I can fit into society or be happy or fulfill my dream, etc." But there are further problems to be tackled, namely the asymmetry between suffering and pleasure. Suffering arises naturally. This can already be seen in this example above about hunger, but it is also actually much greater than just that. To illustrate this, one must just imagine oneself doing nothing for a couple of days or even just one day. If we run this thought experiment, we can then compare the amount of suffering and pleasure that arises naturally without any effort being put in by oneself. The different kinds of suffering include hunger, thirst, boredom, and tiredness, to only name a few. But, as we see, there isn't really much on the other side of the fence. There isn't pleasure to be gained from doing nothing, except perhaps in one's mind and imagination, but even that will fade eventually, and arguably there is still effort being put into it. If we continue this scenario further, after a few days, one's dehydration will become fatal. We can therefore conclude that the amount of suffering that arises naturally and must be prevented through active effort is hugely unequal to the amount of pleasure that arises naturally with zero effort. Another asymmetry is the asymmetry of events that can happen to cause huge amounts of suffering either in the moment or for the rest of one's life afterwards, compared to the events that could cause similar levels of momentary or chronic pleasure, so to speak. Such events include car crashes and other types of certain accidents, illness, chronic pain, and aging, just to name a few. Comparative events that produce similar levels of pleasure either do not exist or are much rarer, such as winning the lottery. Third argument, the hedonic treadmill. This winning the lottery example actually leads directly into another concept that speaks against the bringing of new life into existence. The hedonic treadmill refers to a scientifically proven fact that the human mind adapts to a usual level of neither feeling particularly good nor bad, regardless of the circumstances. That means that even if you win the lottery, after 1 or 2 years, you're statistically going to be on the same level of happiness that you were before this happy event. Now, granted, this is also true for suffering, but as outlined above, it is much more probable to have a sudden spike of suffering, for example through an accident, than it is to have a certain spike of pleasure. Therefore, it is reasonable to conclude that bringing new life into existence, even if we disregard the fact that non-existent life forms aren't able to suffer from deprivation of pleasure, as outlined in the first section, is immoral if viewed from an ultra-realistic standpoint. Fourth point. The problem of retrospective consent. A common objection to this whole worldview of antinatalism is personal experience. Many people say that they themselves feel happy and most other humans do as well. Cut. Fourth point. The problem of retrospective consent. A common objection to the whole worldview of antinatalism is personal experience. Many people say that they themselves feel happy to be brought into existence and that most other humans do as well, and that therefore the view of antinatalism is false. This is an interesting observation since it seems very logical at first. If most people are happy, that must mean that life is inherently good, and it is therefore a good act to create someone new into the world. The problem with this seemingly The problem with this is that it only seemingly offers a solution to the consent problem from above. By saying that they feel happy to have been born, people are giving retrospective consent to their parents for having created them. But this concept of retrospective consent is deeply problematic and wouldn't be applicable in any other situation. Benatar describes this with a rather mundane thought experiment. Imagine you are standing in a line at a bakery and person A pushes you out of the line and gets in front of you. He then proceeds to order you a croissant. Many people would say that person A was in the wrong, even though he gave you something that is arguably much greater value than waiting another minute. Seemingly, if parents decide to create a child, they are pushing them out of non-existence for something that they didn't get to choose the circumstances or, in the analogy, the type of pastry for. They then expect the child to be grateful for the gift of life. But life lacks many important characteristics of a gift. First of all, you're not asked if you want this gift at all. Secondly, and most importantly, you cannot return the gift that you didn't choose without committing suicide. So it is more like a prison sentence than anything else. You don't get to choose when or where to go, and you can't simply leave without committing suicide, which is an option, but is an option that requires action and a huge amount of self-loathing and fighting against the evolutionary instinct to stay alive. One might argue that one could end one's life at any point, but this isn't as easy as it says. One might argue that one could end one's life at any point, but it isn't as easy as it is said. Suicide is heavily stigmatized and in most countries not easily medically accessible. Even then, it is always connected to a risk of something going wrong and or causing immense pain in the moment or for the rest of one's life. The other problem with retrospective consent is the phenomenon of Stockholm Syndrome. This is a psychological phenomenon in which victims of abuse or other horrific circumstances may develop feelings of normalcy or even protectiveness towards the abuser over a long period of time. This isn't recognized as an official psychological condition, but it is being heavily studied and has occurred in numerous cases. Benatar argued that a similar thing could occur towards life itself. As he wrote, I'm paraphrasing, the argument of retrospective consent is defeated by the fact that one can be manipulated after the event occurred to view the event itself in a positive light. End of the phrase. And there can be no denial that on both a biological and societal level there are huge biases towards natalism. So much so that it isn't even considered a moral issue in the first place by most people. If someone says that they have a child and someone asks why, they're usually met with a weird looks or simply the response with typical phrases like "it's a personal matter" or "we just wanted to." This is even more the case when the question is whether they should or shouldn't have a child is posed on someone else. There have also been several cases of children trying to sue their parents for being born because of the consent issue. Of course, these cases are always labeled as satire in the media and are never taken seriously, even though it is a valid question to ask. Conclusion. In conclusion, the heart of antinatalism stays untouched. The absence of suffering is always good, while the absence of pleasure is only bad if there is someone to miss out on said pleasure. Therefore, it is not morally acceptable to create a child, since they cannot ask for it, and their parents are creating them for one selfish reason or another, while expecting them post hoc consent under the pressure of biological and cut. Conclusion. In conclusion, the heart of antinatalism stays untouched. The absence of suffering is always good, while the absence of pleasure is only bad if there is someone to miss that pleasure. Therefore, it is not morally acceptable to create a child, since they didn't ask for it, and the parents are creating the child for one selfish reason or another, while then expecting post hoc consent under the pressure of biological and societal pressures. It is important to say that the point of antinatalism is not to try to claim that all people's lives are more bad than good, but It is important to say that the point of antinatalism is not to try to claim that all people's lives are more bad than good, but that one simply cannot guarantee a good life, whatever the standard for that would be, and that it is therefore ethically irresponsible to force someone else into such a life without their consent. An interesting thought that I want to end on is the sentence, "Don't blame the world for your problems." It's a sentence that has been said a million times, either as motivation or out of annoyance at a supposed laziness of the recipient. But maybe we do have the right to blame the world, or at least our parents, for our problems, because we, as the children, didn't choose to have any of these problems, and none of them would have happened haven't we come into existence and brought into existence by our parents in the first place. Parents are ultimately responsible for every bit of suffering that a child has to go through. Even if the child has personal responsibilities in some of their actions, ultimately it's the parents' fault, since if they wouldn't have created said child, they wouldn't be subject to the suffering. I think every parent should ask themselves the question, why? Why did I have children? Because if it's done honestly, I believe it can lead to some pretty major realizations about oneself. This was the essay. If you somehow stayed until now, thank you very much. I don't know what I will post next on this channel, but yeah, stay tuned for more stuff. Goodbye.